In the fading light of war, history was rewritten not by generals or governments, but by those who buried the truth. Behind the victories and treaties lay a network of hidden files, erased missions, and sealed corridors of silence stretching from the ruins of Berlin to the deserts of New Mexico. These were not legends, but records, stamped, redacted, and forgotten. What survived were fragments, coordinates, code names, and testimonies whispered by men who vanished before they could speak. As the world celebrated peace, another war began, one fought in archives, laboratories, and shadows. Chapter 1. Operation Paperclip's Darker Ledger. In the winter of 1945, while Berlin was still burning and the Allied front pushed eastward, a convoy of American army trucks moved quietly through the Bavarian Alps. The insignia on their doors had been painted over. The soldiers carried no visible weapons, and their orders were written not on standard military letterhead, but on plain paper marked only with a single stamp: Restricted, OSS Liaison. Their destination was a small airstrip outside Garmisch-Partenkirchen, codenamed Camp Overcast. What they were collecting was not gold or art, but mines, the scientific elite of the collapsing Reich. Among them was Dr. Werner Schreiber, an engineer from the Mittelwerk facility who had worked under Werner von Braun on the V2 program. Officially, Schreiber's expertise lay in propulsion systems, yet the documents recovered from his office told another story. There were notes referencing Mittelplatte protocols, Neuberg series, and specimen F7. None of these terms appeared in the Allied debriefing reports that later sanitized his record. Those who escorted him to the United States believed they were rescuing a scientist from Soviet capture. In truth, they were importing something far more complicated, a man whose wartime research skirted the edges of human experimentation. When the Office of Strategic Services was dissolved and replaced by the Central Intelligence Agency in 1947, Schreiber's file was transferred to a new archive in Washington. It bore a new designation, Engineer Number 212. His employment at Fort Bliss was listed under Operation Paperclip, though his project title was heavily redacted. Surviving Internal. Memos between Colonel James Donovan of the U.S. Army Ordnance Department and Dr. Robert McAdams of the RAND Corporation discuss a continuation study related to atmospheric re-entry heat shields, but the attached diagrams show something else, schematics resembling cryogenic chambers rather than rocket components. Schreiber's signature appears in blue ink, dated February 1948, beside the note, "Testing resumed under controlled conditions. See Phoenix Directive." Phoenix Directive appeared nowhere in Paperclip records. Decades later, a Freedom of Information Act request filed by journalist Lillian Clark uncovered fragments of a memorandum stamped Project Phoenix, White Sands Proving Ground. The surviving page referenced psychophysiological tolerance in high-velocity flight environments and listed German personnel by code name Adler, Schwartz, and Geist. Cross-referencing these with declassified Paperclip rosters revealed that only Schreiber matched the geographical data. The experiments described dealt not with aircraft, but with extended hypothermic suspension. The human body, they hypothesized, could be placed into induced hibernation for long-duration flight, a theory rooted in Schreiber's earlier work for the SS Institute for Aviation Medicine. In 1951, Schreiber abruptly disappeared from his post. The official report claimed he had returned to Germany under voluntary repatriation. Yet a classified FBI cable dated March 3, 1952, mentions a Dr. W.S. relocated to Sandia Base, New Mexico, under Defense Project Larkspur. The accompanying photograph, partially obscured by black sensor lines, shows Schreiber's distinctive glasses. Project Larkspur, later linked to early biocontainment research, has no public record before 1954. What existed in that gap remains unknown, though local residents near the base reported a series of unmarked train cars arriving at night from Fort Detrick, Maryland, the epicenter of American biological warfare research. One technician, Harold Kingsley, who worked as a chemical handler at Sandia, recalled an incident in 1953 when an internal alarm sealed the lower laboratories for 3 days. No explanation was given, and afterward, entire sections of the facility were closed off. In a private interview before his death in 1998, Kingsley described seeing storage units the size of coffins, labeled with German serial codes. He also recalled a folder in the control office stamped Morgenlicht Data. That name would resurface years later in a separate Soviet file, suggesting a transnational chain of post-war experimentation derived from captured Axis archives. By the late 1950s, Operation Paperclip was already becoming a controversial relic. NASA's public embrace of von Braun overshadowed its hidden corollary: the programs that did not translate into peaceful technology. When investigative committees in 1961 reviewed the ethics of military medical research, the names Larkspur and Phoenix were quietly excluded from discussion. Some suspect that the surviving documentation had been reclassified under the new MK series of psychological and biological studies. The coincidence in terminology, MKPHX12, appears in a single declassified line item from 1963, corresponding to aeromedical suspension testing. Though no personnel were listed, handwriting analysis matched that of an earlier Schreiber memorandum. The darker ledger of Operation Paperclip was not written in a single file, but scattered across agencies, OSS, CIA, Air Force, and private defense contractors. Each preserved a fragment, but never the whole. One document held in the National Archives refers cryptically to reassignment of Larkspur personnel to Nevada Field Group, Phase 2. Another, found in the RAND archives, includes a requisition order for vacuum cryo-assemblies with German engineering specifications from 1944. To this day, the only remaining trace of Schreiber's work exists in a single microfilm reel labeled Phoenix 13. It was recovered in 1991 from a decommissioned storage vault in Los Alamos. The film, when viewed, displays a series of grainy stills showing human subjects suspended in transparent cylinders. The final frame bears the watermark U.S. Army Medical Research Division, restricted use. If the photographs were authentic, they would indicate experimentation continuing at least into 1956, a full decade after Paperclip's official closure. Attempts to authenticate them have been blocked under national security exemptions. Yet the timeline aligns too closely with parallel Soviet efforts in cryogenic and biological endurance research for coincidence. Historians now believe that Paperclip's darker purpose was not merely to recruit expertise, but to suppress evidence of programs that both sides intended to continue under new flags. When investigators traced Schreiber's supposed repatriation flight manifest, they found that his passenger record terminated mid-route. The plane, an unmarked C-47 listed as U.S. Army Air Transport 1082, departed from Andrews Field, but never officially landed in Frankfurt. Instead, its fuel log indicates a stopover in Goose Bay, Labrador, where records abruptly end. In 1972, a weathered flight jacket bearing his initials was discovered inside a sealed warehouse during renovations at Kirtland Air Force Base, New Mexico. How it arrived there remains unexplained. The legacy of Operation Paperclip's darker ledger endures in those missing pages, in the unacknowledged junction between wartime atrocity and scientific progress. For every celebrated rocket launch that carried man toward the stars, another set of notes was locked away. Notes that described the limits of the human body under extreme isolation, the mapping of consciousness through hypothermia, and the pursuit of suspended animation. Whether these experiments succeeded is unknown, but somewhere in the archives of Sandia or Los Alamos, a box remains sealed. Its contents marked simply, "Recovered from Mittelwerk, 1945. Do not open." Chapter 2. The Vanished Submarine of the Baltic Front. The Baltic Sea in the spring of 1945 was a graveyard of iron. Hundreds of vessels, merchant ships, troop transports, and submarines littered the seabed beneath the freezing grey waves. Among them was U-977, a Type 7C submarine whose final transmission, logged on May 2nd, reported it had scuttled near the Norwegian coast to avoid capture. The Kriegsmarine recorded her as lost. Allied intelligence filed the report away without question. Yet 33 years later, in the autumn of 1978, a Norwegian commercial diving crew exploring off the Skagerrak Trench found a hull lying upright and intact. The identification plate had been ground off, but etched faintly into the steel near the conning tower were 3 digits, 977. When the divers descended into the control room, they found it preserved by the cold. Dials unbroken, gauges still showing pressure, and a logbook fused to the navigation desk by salt and corrosion. The book's leather cover bore the initials HS, believed to stand for Oberleutnant zur See Heinrich Schröder, the recorded second officer of U-977. But the handwriting inside was inconsistent with Schröder's known script, And the entries did not end in May 1945. They continued until September, 4 months after the submarine's official sinking. The coordinates listed placed the vessel not in the North Atlantic, but near Murmansk, deep in Soviet-controlled waters. The discovery triggered immediate classification. The Norwegian Maritime Authority was ordered to suspend the recovery, and within 48 hours, the wreck was sealed under the jurisdiction of NATO Naval Command. The press received a brief statement referring to the find as an unidentified German vessel, yet leaked telex messages between London and Washington reveal the wreck had been codenamed Ghostwave. What intrigued NATO analysts was not simply the survival of a sunken U-boat, but what was found welded inside its aft compartment, a secondary control station bearing Cyrillic lettering and electrical modifications consistent with early 1950s Soviet naval design. Declassified British Admiralty. Reports from 1984 indicate the presence of instrument clusters of mixed manufacture, possibly of post-war Soviet origin. How such equipment came to be installed on a submarine allegedly destroyed in 1945 remains unanswered. Some historians speculated that the Soviets had raised U-977 after the war and refitted her for covert trials. However, a 1951 GRU intelligence intercept declassified after the fall of the USSR refers cryptically to cargo extraction operations from Zone Delta and mentions a Vessel 12B recovered intact, assignment completed. The intercept includes references to Joint Scientific Observation and Operation Serpent Wind, terms absent from any known Soviet naval operation. Photographs recovered from the Norwegian divers, later leaked to the press, show an empty torpedo bay retrofitted with heavy suspension mounts, not for munitions, but for cylindrical containers. Traces of reinforced glass and rubberized sealing suggested they once held something biological or chemical. Chemical analysis of residue from one container revealed traces of perfluorinated compounds, materials used in oxygen saturation experiments during the last months of the Reich's U-boat war. The Germans had been testing liquid breathing systems to allow crews to survive deep dives beyond 300 meters. The Soviets, decades later, would pursue identical research under the name Project Medusa. The deeper mystery was the logbook itself. Among its last entries was one dated September 12, 1945. Cargo delivered to Kolasite, awaiting instruction from O. Kruger. No such officer appears in Kriegsmarine records, but Soviet documents from the same month reference an engineer Krugloff assigned to a facility near Polyarny. If O. Kruger was indeed a pseudonym for Krugloff, it implied collaboration, a German engineer working under Soviet direction only months after the war. Supporting this theory, declassified OSS files reveal that several German naval scientists, initially listed as missing, later appeared in Soviet defense contracts between 1946 and 1948. NATO's internal correspondence following the Ghostwave discovery shows growing concern that the Soviets had not only acquired advanced U-boat technology, but had done so with the aid of captured German crews. A report marked Top Secret, Eyes Only, and dated January 1979, details sonar anomalies recorded across the Baltic, consistent with active propulsion at depths exceeding 400 meters, beyond the limit of known Soviet submarines of that era. The report concludes with a chilling line: possible persistence of modified Type 7C craft. Recommend continued acoustic surveillance. In 1982, during a joint US-Norwegian naval exercise, contact was made with an unidentified submerged object following the same coordinates as the original wreck. The contact displayed erratic depth changes and intermittent power signatures before vanishing. The following week, a classified NATO communique circulated stating, "Target lost. Terminate Ghostwave operations." The wreck site was never revisited. To this day, it remains under permanent exclusion by the Norwegian Navy, officially designated a hazardous munitions area. Surviving personnel from wartime U-977, interviewed decades later in Argentina, denied all knowledge of the extended voyage. Their accounts matched the official version, that the submarine had sailed directly to South America after Germany's surrender, surrendering at Mar del Plata in August 1945. Yet there was an anomaly. The crew list submitted in Argentina included only 33 men. U-977 had departed Norway with 46. 13 names were missing. No remains were found on the wreck. No graves were ever located. In 1995, Russian naval historian Dr. Pavel Voronin unearthed a sealed file from the Central Naval Archives in St. Petersburg labeled Object 12B Serpent Wind. The file contained photographs of a dismantled submarine conning tower bearing both German and Cyrillic markings, alongside technical notes describing extended submersion capability utilizing perfluorocarbon medium. The final page was signed by Captain Kruglov, Northern Fleet Experimental Division, dated October 1945, precisely 1 month after the logbook entry found in the Baltic wreck. The implication was devastating. Either the Soviets had secretly salvaged U-977 before 1946, or they had operated an identical vessel with German cooperation. In either case, it meant the submarine had not been destroyed, but reactivated, part of a covert program to merge captured Axis technology with early Cold War experimentation. Theories emerged suggesting the submarine's purpose had been to transport sensitive materials or personnel from collapsing European fronts to secure Soviet laboratories in the Arctic. A single Soviet document, partially translated in 2003, offers the last fragment of evidence. It references transport of subject specimens to Kola installation for cryogenic study, per agreement with German specialists, Ref. Phoenix Protocol. That same codename, Phoenix, appeared years earlier in the paperclip archives, connected to Dr. Schreiber's cryogenic research. Whether coincidence or coordination, the overlap suggests that both American and Soviet programs may have drawn from a common source, a shared repository of scientific data extracted during the war's final chaos. By the early 2000s, renewed dives at the Skagerrak site found the hull had shifted deeper into the trench, making further recovery impossible. Only fragments remain: a rusted periscope, shattered control levers, and that same logbook, now locked in a NATO archive under seal number NW04521. The final line of its final entry reads simply, "Mission concluded. Await further order." Silence maintained. The vanished submarine of the Baltic front was more than a lost vessel. It was a link, a submerged testament to the clandestine exchange of knowledge between defeated scientists and victorious powers unwilling to admit their partnership. Somewhere beneath those cold waters lies the steel evidence of that hidden transaction, sealed by depth, time, and silence. Chapter 3: The Red Files of Operation Gladio. In the winter of 1947, as Europe tried to rebuild from the ashes of war, the American Office of Policy Coordination quietly began funding a network of resistance cells across Western Europe. Officially, these were stay-behind units, partisans who would organize guerrilla operations in the event of a Soviet invasion. Their existence was denied by every participating government, but they were real, and their codename within NATO communications was Gladio. Decades later, when fragments of the operation were exposed, the public learned only part of the truth. The rest, the so-called Red Files, remained buried under layers of security clearances and diplomatic silence. The first whispers of the Red Files emerged from an abandoned storage depot in Bologna in 1990, where Italian police found sealed metal containers stamped with the NATO trident and the label Confidential Allied Coordination Bureau. Inside were rolls of microfilm, coded correspondence between the CIA, MI6 and Italian military intelligence, and operational maps showing arms caches across Europe. One film reel bore a handwritten label in German, Rot Zelle, Directive 29. When translated, that meant Red Cell. Investigators assumed it referred to communist infiltration, but the files told a different story. Gladio itself had a splinter division, one operating outside formal NATO oversight, documents. Within the cache indicated that this Red Cell carried out psychological and paramilitary actions designed to sway public opinion against the political left. Bombings, assassinations, and propaganda campaigns were staged to appear as the work of communist extremists. The microfilms detailed one such event in chilling precision: the 1958 bombing of a trade union office in Milan. The attack was officially blamed on a radical group, yet a Red Cell memorandum labeled Operation Mock Cross describes the explosion as successful, civilian losses acceptable, objective met. The memo bore the signature A. Sinclair, believed to be a pseudonym used by a British liaison officer, attached to MI6's psychological warfare branch. The Red Files also contained payment ledgers. Disguised as defense contracts, They listed shell companies based in Zurich and Brussels that funneled money into covert operations. One entry on a ledger sheet dated 1961 read, "Funds transferred to Committee for European Security Studies, Ref Monte Carlo." Cross-checking that name with declassified CIA archives revealed that the committee was a front established by Alan Dulles himself to manage off-the-books financing for anti-Soviet propaganda. That same year, a separate communication from Rome referenced Directive Nero, ordering the fabrication of evidence linking left-wing labor groups to Soviet arms smuggling. But the most damning revelations came from a series of personal letters written by Colonel Guido Ferrante, an officer of the Italian Carabinieri seconded to NATO command in Brussels. His correspondence with an American contact named R.J. Porter discussed an internal split within Gladio. Certain operatives no longer report to command, but to a parallel structure. Orders are issued under red-sealed envelopes. Ferrante's final letter, dated March 1962, ends abruptly with the line, "They have begun using civilian targets." He was found dead 3 weeks later, officially the victim of a car accident. As the Cold War intensified, the Red Cell expanded its reach. Files recovered from French intelligence archives mention Operation Brumaire, a campaign of selective sabotage against media outlets deemed sympathetic to socialist parties. One note in the margins of a Paris field report reads, "Same pattern as Italy. Handlers trained in Fort Monmouth, NJ." This was significant. Fort Monmouth was known to host US Army signal intelligence operations, not covert paramilitary instruction. Yet the connection suggests that communications intercepts and disinformation dissemination were coordinated across the Atlantic. In 1971, the Belgian parliamentary inquiry into domestic terrorism quietly requested NATO's cooperation to identify Gladio structures within its borders. The response came 6 months later. No such units exist. However, a NATO internal memo recovered in 1998 from the Brussels headquarters contradicts this, referencing contingency plans for Red Cell contingents operating under AC-46 protocol. That protocol, dated 1954, outlined emergency procedures for clandestine activities in the event of internal subversion. In other words, Gladio's hidden branch could be legally activated against its own population if political instability threatened NATO cohesion. Witness testimonies collected in the 1980s began to align with the Red Files implications. A former Italian intelligence officer, Mario Forlani, confessed during a parliamentary hearing that certain bombings during the so-called Years of Lead were guided by Western intelligence. When asked for specifics, he cited Directive 29 and Red Cell Brussels. Though many dismissed his claims as conspiracy, a forensic comparison of his statements with the Bologna microfilms confirmed identical code designations. One of the film strips, marked C-79, contained a list of operatives trained in Sardinia under the supervision of 2 unnamed American officers. Among the names deciphered was D. Amsel, cross-referencing that alias with CIA personnel manifests revealed a possible match to Donald Ames, a psychological operations specialist stationed in Europe between 1955 and 1964. His debriefing reports, later declassified, describe emergency preparedness programs involving paramilitary contingents. When a journalist attempted to question him in 1987, Ames declined comment, stating only, "Those files were never meant to see light." Even within NATO, awareness of Red Cell's operations was fragmented. The Shape Command in Mons, Belgium, kept its existence within a small circle under the Supreme Allied Commander Europe's personal authority. A 1972 directive titled Security Clarification ACB Red Contingents ordered destruction of duplicate records, replacing them with sanitized summaries labeled Civil Defense Readiness Exercises. In essence, history itself was rewritten. The Bologna microfilms contained not just operational documents but psychological studies. One dossier titled Group Dynamics Under Fear Induction included interviews conducted by American behavioral scientists during 1950s trials in Italy. The objective? To test how fear of subversion could influence public perception and voting behavior. The experiments were funded through NATO's political committee and overseen by a Dr. C. Halverson, believed to be a cover for Dr. Carl H., a known consultant for Project MK Ultra. Through coordinated bombings, falsified evidence, and manipulated news cycles, Red Cell's purpose was not defense, it was social engineering. By the 1980s, traces of the network began to unravel. A fire in a military depot near Verona destroyed what Italian magistrates later identified as Gladio's largest weapons cache. 2 officers responsible for security at the site disappeared days before being called to testify. Their personnel files were later found erased from Ministry of Defense archives. The remaining red files that survived the Bologna seizure were transferred to Brussels under seal, and only a fraction was ever released. What remains classified bears the notation sensitive, may compromise, allied governments. In the years following their partial exposure, governments across Europe issued official denials. The CIA and NATO both claimed that any illegal activities were unauthorized actions by rogue elements. Yet no one could explain how rogue elements had access to encrypted communications, NATO funding, and diplomatic protection for nearly 4 decades. The paper trail leads in loops from Washington to Rome, from London to Brussels, from the Cold War into the modern era. What makes the red files particularly disturbing is the evidence of continuity. A memorandum from 1978 lists psychological continuation programs under civilian facade, identifying newer think tanks and research centers as the operational descendants of Gladio. One such institute, the European Institute for Strategic Studies in Geneva, received unexplained funding through NATO's Public Diplomacy Division as recently as 1983. The handwritten annotation at the bottom of the page, possibly from a NATO intelligence officer, reads simply, "Rote Zell lives." Today, the Bologna cache, or what remains of it, is locked within a climate-controlled vault at the NATO archives in Brussels, box number 11C48. Researchers are not permitted to view the red cell microfilms, citing ongoing sensitivity of Allied operations. The official narrative maintains that Operation Gladio was disbanded and its weapons decommissioned, but fragments of testimony, missing witnesses, and those surviving reels of film tell another version, one where Europe's peace was carefully staged, its stability maintained not by diplomacy, but by manipulation. Somewhere inside those red files lies the proof that the Cold War's longest operation was not about stopping communism. It was about controlling fear. Chapter 4. The Siberian Vault, Project Morgenlicht. In the late autumn of 1952, Soviet surveyors charting the Altai Mountains for mineral resources stumbled upon a network of tunnels sealed behind concrete bulkheads and iron doors. The site lay some 400 kilometers northeast of Novosibirsk, near the Chuya River Basin, a region officially uninhabited since the evacuation of wartime labor camps. Initial inspection revealed blast doors marked in German, "Nicht öffnen ohne Befehl," do not open without orders. Local authorities reported the finding to the Ministry of Internal Affairs, which dispatched a joint NKVD-KGB recovery team under the codename Morgenlicht, or Morning Light. The name came directly from documents recovered on site, stamped with the insignia of the SS Ahnenerbe, the Nazi research institute dedicated to pseudoscientific and occult studies. The first exploration team, led by Major Konstantin Alexeyev, entered the tunnels on November 9, 1952. What they discovered defied simple categorization. Deep inside the granite hillside, they found a facility equipped with heavy generators, decontamination chambers, and storage cylinders containing liquid nitrogen. Scrawled across the walls were technical notes in German referencing energetische Umwandlung durch magnetische Felder, energy conversion through magnetic fields. The Soviets photographed everything, then sealed the vault and transported the equipment by rail to an undisclosed laboratory near Akademgorodok, Novosibirsk. There, the artifacts were catalogued under Object 2305, Morgenlicht. Declassified Soviet reports released briefly in the 1990s detail the contents of those archives before they vanished again from public access. Among them were 26 reels of technical schematics labeled Juret 47, 6 storage cylinders bearing the Reichsadler emblem, and a single steel cabinet filled with microfilm. The microfilm contained correspondence between German scientists referencing polar emissions and ion field oscillations. The last dated entry was April 1945, signed by an Obersturmführer, Kurt Aberle, believed to be attached to the SS Technical Bureau in Prague. His name appears nowhere else in post-war documentation, suggesting he either perished or was absorbed into one of the Allied intelligence programs, Soviet intelligence. Officers at the time concluded that the bunker had been constructed late in the war as a repository for experimental technology evacuated from central Germany. Several recovered maps marked Sonderanlage 88 pointed towards similar facilities in Silesia and Thuringia, regions later overrun by the Red Army. But what set Morgenlicht apart was its location, far beyond any known German front line. The prevailing theory among GRU analysts was that the facility had been established by retreating SS units using forced labor from captured Soviet engineers during the 1943-1944 withdrawal. By 1954, scientists under the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, the Soviet body responsible for nuclear development, began attempting to reverse engineer what they had found. Internal memoranda refer to anomalous magnetic resonance phenomena detected when powering the Morgenlicht generators. One report, marked Eyes Only, Level 4, describes a faint luminescent field forming around the test chamber and a measurable drop in ambient temperature. 2 technicians suffered severe radiation burns despite negligible Geiger counter readings. The phenomenon was never officially explained. In 1956, the Morgenlicht research files were transferred to Research Site 7, a newly built complex in Kazakhstan. The classified codename M program appeared in correspondence between Moscow and the facility's director, Colonel Yuri Serov. Western intelligence analysts would later identify this as a parallel to the American Project Phoenix, both involving high-energy field manipulation derived from wartime German archives. What linked them was a single fragment, an intercepted note from Serov to his superior reading. Preliminary reconstruction of Gerrit 47 yields strong magnetic field inversion. Hypothesis consistent with Schreiber data. The Schreiber mentioned here is believed to be Dr. Werner Schreiber, the paperclip scientist whose experiments in cryogenic and electromagnetic suspension had been lost to American secrecy. The first full test of the reconstructed Morgenlicht generator occurred on March 18, 1957. According to declassified summaries, the device consisted of concentric copper coils surrounding a cylindrical chamber cooled to -110 degrees Celsius. The experiment was intended to study energy output fluctuations, but at 21 to 46 hours, power readings spiked off scale. The lights in the facility flickered, instruments froze, and several witnesses described a vibration without sound. One engineer, Anatoly Rudenko, later testified that for approximately 12 seconds, all magnetic compasses within 50 meters spun violently before ceasing entirely. The chamber cracked open due to pressure, releasing a dense vapor that crystallized instantly. The generator was destroyed. The project was suspended indefinitely. Officially, Morgenlicht was deemed a failure, but Soviet scientific committees continued investigating its remnants in secret. KGB reports from the 1960s mention recurring illnesses among surviving personnel, nervous tremors, skin lesions, and unexplained memory gaps. Western observers only became aware of these anomalies after 1963, when CIA reconnaissance photographs showed a nearly identical structure under construction in northern Kazakhstan. Labeled by analysts as Research Site 7B, it bore the same architectural layout as the original Morgenlicht facility. The photographs were annotated. Possible continuation of electromagnetic suspension testing. Recommend monitoring for nuclear byproducts. Throughout the Cold War, references to Project Morgenlicht appeared sporadically in both Soviet and Western intelligence. One East German defector in 1972, a physicist named Hans Goertz, claimed to have seen a prototype generator during a visit to the Kazakh site. In his debriefing with West German intelligence, Goertz described a ring-shaped device capable of sustaining plasma without combustion. He was dismissed as delusional. 2 months later, he was found dead in a Hamburg hotel, ruled a suicide despite signs of struggle. His briefcase, containing notes on field harmonics, was never recovered. Archival researchers who later examined Soviet records uncovered multiple code names that may have referred to the same project: Ognivo, Voзвrat, and Morgenlicht. Each involved magnetic field research linked to unidentified German documents. One classified memo dated April 1964 referenced cooperation between Soviet physicists and former Nazi engineers relocated after the war, some likely acquired through secret prisoner exchanges with the West. If true, both superpowers may have pursued identical lines of experimentation, each unaware that the other held the missing half of the original German design. By the late 1970s, the Morgenlicht site in the Altai had become a restricted military zone, Satellite imagery revealed an airstrip, new concrete structures, and thermal signatures consistent with underground operations. Local villagers reported occasional tremors and strange lights in the sky. Then, in 1983, the area was suddenly evacuated, following what Soviet media called a geological incident. No details were provided. Internal KGB messages later declassified briefly mention containment breach, Section 3 collapsed. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, fragments of Morgenlicht's archive were smuggled into the West by researchers seeking to sell them. Among the recovered documents was a technical diagram titled Energieausgleichseinheit, 1944, describing a power system utilizing rotational plasma alignment, a concept decades ahead of known physics at the time. The diagram bore signatures of both German and Cyrillic annotation, evidence of post-war continuation. Analysis of the paper's watermark confirmed it originated from a Soviet manufacturer circa 1956. Today, the ruins of the original Siberian vault lie beneath layers of permafrost, guarded by what remains of Russian military security. Occasional expeditions report electromagnetic interference near the site. A 2012 geological survey team attempting to map the area experienced total failure of electronic instruments within a 3-kilometer radius. Their equipment logs recorded unexplained spikes in localized magnetic flux. The official explanation attributes it to mineral deposits. What was Project Morgenlicht? A desperate wartime experiment in energy conversion, a weapon or something else, a failed attempt to harness forces beyond conventional science. Whatever it was, both American and Soviet intelligence fought to control it, burying the truth under decades of secrecy. In the faded Soviet file marked Object 2305, one handwritten sentence remains legible beneath layers of redacted ink. Light from the morning is not for man. Chapter 5. The Black Ledger of Dresden. When the Allied bombers set Dresden ablaze in February 1945, entire districts were turned to ash in a single night. Among the rubble of the administrative quarter, firemen later uncovered the remains of a military convoy, charred trucks bearing the insignia of the Reich Security main office. Their cargo had been reduced to twisted metal and burned leather, except for one object found wedged between the stones of a collapsed cellar, a black-bound ledger. Its cover bore no title, only a faint imprint of the SS Totenkopf symbol. The book was delivered to a British field intelligence officer, Captain Harold Devereux, who logged it in a temporary evidence report as Recovered Journal, Unidentified Unit. After 1946, the ledger vanished into British archives, where it remained unseen for nearly 40 years. The ledger resurfaced in 1984, when historian Ingrid Scholl gained access to declassified materials from the Foreign Office. Inside, she found not accounts or troop lists, but coordinates, hundreds of them, alongside cryptic phrases such as Protocol 19, Transport K, and Final Relocation Phase. Many entries were dated between December 1944 and February 1945 and were signed with the abbreviation S-1005Z. The notation matched the designation of Sonderkommando 1005, a unit under SS-Standartenführer Paul Blobel, tasked with erasing evidence of Nazi mass graves. The Z suffix indicated a sub-detachment operating in the general government, likely Poland. Scholl's discovery sent ripples through historical and intelligence circles. The existence of a Z division had never been recorded. Cross-referencing the ledger's coordinates with wartime aerial photographs revealed patterns of excavation across Saxony, Silesia, and eastern Poland areas that, according to official histories, held no major extermination sites. Yet Soviet records from post-liberation field units contained brief references to temporary detention camps, operating near some of those coordinates. These camps were dismantled within weeks of the German retreat, their locations never officially mapped. A deeper examination of the ledger's entries exposed disturbing language. Under Protocol 19, a line read, "Transfer 12 specimens from Block E under Medical Directive R." Further pages use similar terms: biological transport, preserve integrity, liquidation after assessment. These were not military movements but clinical operations. British analysts who reviewed the material in 1946 had annotated one margin with possible SS medical file, but no follow-up investigation was recorded. The wartime chaos had swallowed the evidence whole. Scholl traced one coordinate string, P-20N, 19-45E, to an area near Piotrków Trybunalski, Poland. Excavation in 1986 revealed concrete foundations and subterranean corridors filled with collapsed brick. Artifacts recovered included surgical instruments bearing the mark SS Sanitätsdienststelle and glass containers labeled only Versuch 7. Radiation testing detected residual contamination, low but measurable, consistent with isotopes used in early radiological research. No records exist of such research in that region. The Polish Institute of National Remembrance classified the site as unconfirmed experimental facility. Archival documents later released from Soviet holdings indicated that their counterintelligence units had also encountered remnants of the same operation. A 1946 NKVD report described the capture of a German transport convoy near Lublin carrying medical cargo and sealed metal coffins. The report's author noted that orders accompanying the convoy referenced continuation eastward under Phoenix. Clearance, that codename Phoenix, had already appeared in American paperclip files and Soviet Morgenlicht archives. The implication was that both powers were intercepting fragments of the same erased operation. During the late 1940s, British and American intelligence began quietly transferring selected Nazi scientists and doctors to their respective territories under secret programs. Among those listed in the US manifests was Dr. Emil Hartmann, a biophysicist attached to the SS Medical Corps. His captured notes describe cryogenic tissue suspension under field conditions. Though his work was officially categorized as theoretical, a notation in his personal file reads, "Successful. Application in relocation testing, February 1945. The date aligns precisely with the final entries of the Dresden Ledger. What relocation meant has been debated for decades. Some historians argue it referred to mass prisoner transfers. Others, studying the medical terminology within the ledger, suggest human experimentation involving cryogenic or radiological endurance, research that anticipated post-war aerospace medicine. A separate CIA memorandum from 1952, declassified only in fragments, makes reference to Protocol 19 data samples acquired through confidential exchange, Poland sector. The memo's margins note information consistent with prior Phoenix directives. Once again, the same codename surfaced, threading paperclip, Morgenlicht, and now the Dresden Ledger into a single hidden continuum. In 1991, forensic experts conducted ink analysis on the recovered pages. The results proved the materials were authentic and dated precisely to the war's final months. Under ultraviolet light, faint impressions revealed erased notations. One appeared to read Kriegslabor T4, a name linked to the euthanasia programs that had preceded the Holocaust. The investigators concluded that Sonderkommando Pan 5Z was likely a cleanup unit, assigned not only to destroy evidence of mass killings, but to recover specific research assets deemed valuable to the Reich's collapsing scientific establishment. As the Cold War drew to a close, Western archives began releasing limited records of intelligence sharing with the Soviets during the occupation of Germany. Among them was a British MI6 cable dated August 1945, referencing joint review of medical freight recovered in Dresden Zone, status to be divided by agreement. The phrase medical freight appears nowhere else in post-war documentation, yet it strongly implies a coordinated partition of seized research material between Allies and Soviets. The ledger, in that context, was not a mere list of crimes. It was an inventory. One entry in the ledger stands apart from the rest. Dated February 12, 1945, it reads, Transport K complete. Documentation to Arctic route. Authorization Morgenlicht 2. The signature beneath, O. Kruger, matches the alias found in the recovered U-boat logbook from the Baltic. If this connection is genuine, then the same network responsible for smuggling materials east via submarine may have been coordinating overland shipments through Dresden in the war's final days. The convergence of names and codenames across unrelated archives, Kruger, Phoenix, Morgenlicht, suggests that Germany's dying war machine was consolidating its most sensitive research before total defeat, distributing it among those who would continue it in secret. Modern historians attempting to follow the trail have encountered obstruction at every turn. The Dresden Ledger remains sealed in the British National Archives under classification PRO Refen 1187, security embargo until 2065. When questioned, government spokesmen cite Continuing International, Sensitivities. Rumors persist that microfilm copies were quietly shared with US and German intelligence during the 1990s to assist in identifying post-war medical data transfers. None of these have been publicly confirmed, yet fragments continue to surface. In 2009, a Polish archaeologist excavating near Łódź uncovered a buried strongbox containing glass slides and paperwork bearing the insignia of the SS Sanitary Division. The handwriting matched that of the Dresden Ledger's final entries. Among the slides were preserved tissue samples still viable for DNA extraction. Testing revealed mixed human and animal cellular structures, hybrids consistent with attempts at organ preservation. The find was reclassified within weeks, removed from Polish custody, and transferred to an undisclosed facility in the United Kingdom. The official reason given was biohazard risk. The Dresden Ledger endures as the darkest artifact of the war's aftermath, bridging atrocity and ambition. It is both confession and blueprint. Every name redacted from its pages represents a chain of custody stretching from the inferno of 1945 to the laboratories of the Cold War. The truth it contains is less about the crimes it recorded and more about what those crimes became once absorbed into the secret machinery of victory. The ledger's final words, scrawled in haste across a half-burned page, are barely legible but unmistakable. All evidence relocated, future secured. The experiment continues. As the last of the sealed files were transferred to cold storage and the lights of the archives flickered out, one question remained unanswered. How many other ledgers, vaults, and forgotten convoys still lie buried beneath decades of dust and denial? The scattered threads, paperclip, Gladio, Morgenlicht, Dresden, form a web that stretches beyond the end of the war itself. Every document unsealed reveals another still hidden, another erased name, another operation never meant to be known. The war may have ended on paper in 1945, but its shadows still move quietly beneath the archives, waiting for the next file to be found.